The East End of London holds an important place in British folk culture. You only have to think of Cockney rhyming slang, pearly kings and queens and the music halls, which are somewhat trivial examples of this. But the East End also played an important part in the development of Britain's political history. The Labour Party, for example, was very largely founded in the East End of London. And for us as nationalists, the East End also holds a very important place. Mythically, to Liberals at least, the East End was formed by succeeding waves of migrants coming to the area. For example, the Flemings, the Irish, the Huguenots, later than that the Jews, and the much more recent waves of immigrants that have come and tended to have settled in the East End as well. The earlier groups of migrants that came here all shared a common European culture, and after perhaps initial problems with their arrival, they merged into the overall English host population. This is quite different from the recent waves of migrants that have come here from totally different cultures. As recently as the early 1970s, the East End was 95% white. Since that time, there's been a massive change. The East End has effectively been ethnically cleansed. The East End, as portrayed on politically correct television programmes, but run by the BBC, for example, is a myth. It no longer exists. It's been totally flattened and wiped out. We're going to take a look now at the East End, its political history and culture, and see how it has been totally obliterated. For me, this is a bit of a personal tour. Although I'm not from the East End, I lived here for a large number of years and spent most of my political career active in the East End as branch organiser of Tower Hamlets branch throughout most of the 80s and into the early 90s. The poor working class East End has always been regarded in contrast to the affluent West End. Due to prevailing winds, the stink of the early city drifted eastwards. Poor people congregated in the first suburbs to the east of the old Roman walls of London. These suburbs were in the shadow of the Tower of London, which was built by the Normans under William the Conqueror, and stand as a symbol of the last time England was subjugated under the heel of a foreign ruling class. The suburbs to the east of the Tower were called Tower Hamlets. This is St Dunstan's church in Stepney. It's medieval and was built when Stepney was a village, separated from the city by fields. The church bells are commemorated in the song Oranges and Lemons, with the line, "When will that be, said the bells of Stepney." The churchyard used to be known for its memorials. Now few are left. 10 or so years ago, this graveyard was totally vandalised and covered in Bangladeshi graffiti. St Dunstan's has always flown the Red Duster, the flag of the Merchant Navy, in recognition of the seafaring connections of the East End. The flag still flies, somewhat torn and tattered, somehow symbolising the decline of the East End. East London really started to grow, and the isolated villages become swallowed up in the metropolis as a result of a rise in England's maritime trade. As London became one of the greatest port cities in the world, the river frontage of the Thames became busier and spread eastwards. This now empty stretch of the river was for hundreds of years a scene of massive activity. It was the hub of empire trade. It was also the point of departure for many colonists who went from these shores to open up sparsely populated areas of the globe to Anglo-Saxon settlement and civilization. This memorial is to colonists who set sail for Virginia from this site. Labour's grotesque vanity project, the billion-pound waste of space, the Millennium Dome, looks mockingly over from the other side of the river. As the riverfront grew ever more crowded, docks were built with associated warehouses. Thousands were attracted to work in these docks, and it was amongst these workers that the labour movement gained some of its earlier supporters. There was tremendous agitation to improve the conditions under which the dockers worked. These union leaders were the founding fathers of the Labour Party, and also great patriots, men like Ben Tillett, Will Thorne and Will Crooks. Will Crooks was one of the leaders of the successful 1889 dock strike, and he became the first Labour mayor in London of Poplar in 1901, and was one of Labour's first MPs when he won a by-election in 1903. He was a patriotic socialist and is buried in Tower Hamlets Cemetery. The docks in the East End employed over 200,000 people as late as the 1960s and handled a record 60 million tonnes of goods in 1961. Yet due to containerisation, the old docks were doomed and new facilities downriver at Tilbury took over. For example, St Catherine's Dock near the Tower of London closed in 1969. It's now a marina. The West India and Millwall docks on the Isle of Dogs closed in 1970, and they now serve as a backdrop to yuppie housing and office developments. The East India docks closed in 1967 and they're now a nature reserve. This was an inevitable change that might be regretted for sentimental reasons, but sometimes you have to be realistic and move with the times.
When people talk about British shipbuilding, they usually talk about the North East, Barrow-in-Furness, Belfast, Glasgow. Few people know that in the Victorian period, the Thames estuary is one of the biggest shipbuilding areas in Britain. At the turn of the 19th century, this site here was the location of the Thames Ironworks shipbuilding yard. It would have been a hive of activity. Interestingly enough, not a lot of people know this, but Thames Ironworks football team, the Works football team, later became West Ham United, which is why the West Ham fans in their stands to this day shout out, "Come on you Irons." In 1898, a big battleship, HMS Albion, was launched from here as a ship of 13,000 tonnes, part of the naval race against Germany at that time. HMS Albion was 390 feet long. 30,000 people turned up to see the launch. People were patriotic in those days and they wanted to see the British Empire in all its might and glory as represented by the Royal Navy. Because the boat was so long, they couldn't launch it bow first in the traditional manner straight into the river, because it would have crashed into the harbour wall on the other side there. So they had to launch it sideways in from the bank, from those muddy banks effectively just down there, and to launch it sideways in into the river. When the boat was launched, HMS Albion, when it hit the water, it set off a massive tidal wave that swept into the stands where these people were watching it, and tragically 38 people lost their lives through drowning, men, women and children.
The mass grave to the victims of that tragedy can be found in a nearby cemetery. HMS Albion went on to fight for Britain during the First World War. Today, there's an important amphibious warfare ship in the Royal Navy that bears the name of HMS Albion and continues the traditions of that famous name. Queen Mary College, past the University of London on Mile End Road, holds an important place in the history of British nationalism. This part of the college is known as the People's Palace, and it hosted two British Brothers League meetings in 1902 and 1903. Organisationally, the British Brothers League can be seen as the first political manifestation of British nationalism, although it was a pressure group rather than a political party. The British Brothers League was set up in 1898 and was led by William Evans Gordon, the MP for Stepney. The British Brothers League was set up to oppose the influx of what were effectively asylum seekers and economic migrants from Eastern Europe. Then as now, London was a magnet for these migrants, and due to the docks, most settled in the East End. These meetings directly led to the passing of the 1905 Aliens Act that restricted immigration to Britain, so the BBL was largely successful in its aims. The British Brothers League is sometimes caricatured as being an anti-Jewish group, as many of the immigrants at that time were Eastern European Jews. However, two